the concerns of philosophy. And by that we can also get a picture of the divisions of philosophy. That is, the most basic area of philosophy is metaphysics. Metaphysics is that branch of philosophy dealing with the question of being or existence. What exists? What exists is not a serious question for us, because we all believe this exists, that exists. We have no doubt about these things. But the philosopher goes deeper and deeper to analyze, to seek what actually exists and what ultimately exists. This is the question raised by metaphysicians, and you have asked the question, what is the meaning of that we say philosophers normally disagree? It's because philosophy is, to begin with, skeptical. Remember that the Greek word skeptic originally means inquirer, not a doubter. Skepticism is considered as the philosophy of, or the method of doubt. But the original Greek word, or the original meaning of the Greek word skeptic is inquirer, and a philosopher is just that, inquires without any presupposition is the thing. But when we approach life, daily life, we have our presuppositions, that we believe that the flag is moving, the tree is in the yard, or you are sitting before me. These are all common sense things. But the philosopher goes deeper and deeper to find out what is ultimately real. And the question of ultimate reality divides philosophers into opposite camps. Take, for example, the great Greek philosopher Plato, who is considered as the founder of idealism. He argued that ideas or forms, or more clearly our thoughts, have an independent existence. They exist, ideas exist independently of any other object. So, Plato asked the question, if beautiful things are so beautiful, then how beautiful beauty will be, is a question. So, he considered the idea of beauty, goodness, justice, all these things as existing in the heaven of reality, which is apart from and independent of worldly objects. That is why we call them idealists. At the same time, you see materialists. For example, Karl Marx in the modern world argued against all forms of idealism and considered ideas as a byproduct of objective reality. Marx, for example, recognized ideas as emerging from real life. So, real objective world produces ideas, not vice versa, is the position of materialists. And when we come to the second branch of philosophy, namely epistemology, this problem of disagreement is more complex. When you ask, for example, you make a statement, I know X. It's a very simple statement. I know X. For an ordinary person, there is no dispute about the statement or the meaning of the statement that I know X. But when you say I know X to a philosopher, philosopher comes out with the question, what do you mean by this I? Technically the subject of knowledge. And what do you mean by this X? That is the object of knowledge. You have to explain how this I, the subject, is related to the object X. So, this kind of explanation makes epistemology a very, very active area of philosophical discourse. Take, for example, Indian theories of knowledge, very rich in their principles and postulates. I will just refer to the Indian concept of pramanas, or the sources and standards of valid knowledge, what you call true knowledge. What is the standard? Indian epistemologists recognize perception, then there is inference, then there is comparison, and in the Indian context there is one more thing as the source of genuine knowledge, that is Shruti or verbal testimony. And you can see that in classical Indian philosophy, these Vaisheshikas, for example, Nyaya philosophers, all of them actually disagree upon what is the actual reliable source of knowledge and truth. Some of them recognize only perception as the valid, reliable source of knowledge. That is, true knowledge you can acquire only by perception, sense perception. This was the position held by the Indian materialists, widely known as Charvakas.
Okay, sir. But epistemology deals with knowledge.
Knowledge.
How that must be very different from metaphysics, right, sir?
Not exactly different. Actually, epistemology is a part of metaphysics, no doubt. Only thing is, metaphysics explains or tries to explain the ultimate reality, but epistemology raises the question, what is the means to attain knowledge of that truth? So, you can say that one is metaphysics is basically concerned with the goal of philosophical pursuit, that is what is the ultimate reality, whereas epistemology is concerned with the means to knowledge. I told you Charvakas consider perception as the only valid source of knowledge, and there are systems which recognize all the four, that is perception, inference, comparison and verbal testimony. And verbal testimony, what is called Shruti, has been always a matter of dispute in Indian epistemology, because philosophers in India are divided on this question, whether you accept the testimony of Vedas as Shruti or whether you reject the dependence on Vedas. This question makes actually the first and the most clear division among classical Indian philosophers into orthodox group and heterodox group. So, I told you that then you take one more area of philosophy, sometimes a third important one, namely axiology. Axiology is in simple terms defined as the study of values. But value, when you take in the case of economics, is different from value as explained by philosophers. Philosophers consider value in terms of ethics, one, that is moral values. Then in terms of the norms of beauty, the aesthetic value. So, the question is, what are the standards of these values? There are two, again I will refer back to that question of disagreement. In ethics it is clear, that is many philosophers interested in ethics like Immanuel Kant recognize moral values as absolutely real. There are certain values, for example, justice, truth, such about, you can see about truth, Indian philosophy very clearly actually very clearly elevates the value of truth beyond everything. And in the West, philosophers like Kant also recognize moral values as eternal, immortal and absolute. But at the same time, there are relativists who argue that there is no moral value that is beyond space and time. Every value, every moral precept is determined by specific socio-cultural conditions, is the position of relativists. So, the dispute between absolutists and relativists is very, very vibrant in the field of ethics. And coming to aesthetics, the study of the norms of beauty. You can see that for an ordinary man there is no doubt about the question, certain things are beautiful and certain things are not beautiful. But how can you say that your judgment upon beauty agrees with my judgment upon beauty? So, when I say that a certain thing X is beautiful, you may disagree with me and say that X is not beautiful. So, aesthetics proposes a very, very important question. Where does beauty lie? Is it in the object we perceive, or is it in the mind of the perceiver? This position splits aestheticians into objectivists and subjectivists. That is, those who recognize beauty as lying in the object perceived, and those subjectivists who consider beauty inherent in the mind of the perceiver.
Sir, I personally believe beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So, based on two explanations, is there no middle point where we can agree that beauty
Yes.
is in the object and the beholder?
Middle position is always comfortable, but philosophical disputes put forth logical arguments for either side. Objectivists always try to justify their position with logical reasons. Subjectivists do the same thing with sometimes stronger arguments. But as you told, there is the scope for a middle position in aesthetics. One thing is very clear, that is, without the object there is no question of beauty, and without a subject to perceive the object there is no judgment of beauty. So, you can refer to the Indian aestheticians. Very clearly you can understand the concept of rasa in Indian aesthetics, or you can try to understand the concept of laya in Indian art. So, actually there is an element of dissolution, that is, all these differences between the object, the perceiver, and the act of perception or appreciation, these differences actually vanish in the actual context of aesthetic appreciation. That is, all these things unite to become one single experience in rasa that gives you the laya, the feeling of what is called a kind of synthesized appreciation. That state of laya has been emphasized in Indian aesthetics, and that will make possible an explanation for your question, that is it lying in the perceiver's mind or is it lying in the object? Both is the answer possible from the Indian aesthetics. So, we consider all these areas, that is metaphysics, epistemology and axiology. They make one important contribution, that is normally considered as the basic thing done by philosophers and philosophy. That is, they define the basic questions and issues. What is the problem actually? So, philosophy is actually discovering the problem rather than giving you an answer. Philosophers are not supposed to give you an answer to the question. Take for example, the dispute between theists and atheists over the existence or non-existence of God. We find that ordinary people are divided into two camps, that is, those who believe in God and those who deny the existence of God. But philosophers go deeper and deeper into the various implications of the question itself. So, philosophy is carrying out a very important task in the domain of knowledge, that is defining problems rather than explaining their answers.
So, usually common people do not consider philosophy approachable. technically how does it become a part of their lives?
Yes, that we will explain with reference to certain precepts in philosophy. That is, you know that how scientific knowledge is different from philosophy is the crux of your question, I think. That we have scientific knowledge which is normally applied in specific cases and becomes useful to humankind. But what is the application or use of knowledge in philosophy or the precepts and principles in philosophy is a question. I will take just two examples. Sometimes the most famous one from the great Greek thinker Socrates. Socrates did not write anything, but he always reminded that the task of philosophy is nothing but know thyself. Self-knowledge is the portfolio of philosophical investigation. And I will invite your attention to a Zen story or a Zen koan. That is, Zen Buddhists say that happiness is the absence of the striving for happiness. Repeat, happiness is the absence of the striving for happiness. My point is that if you analyze these two things, that is know thyself and happiness is the absence of the striving for happiness, you can understand that you cannot apply it like an invention or a discovery in science. Only possible way to practice philosophy is the introspection of these precepts. That is, you have to think and think and think of yourself, analyze yourself, try to understand yourself, but always in relation to the world in which you are living. So, this is the task of philosophy, and one problem in applying philosophical precepts is that it requires your lifelong attention and devotion to practice philosophy. That is the only point. You can take for example, the yoga scheme in Indian tradition. That is, yoga scheme is being recognized as a very clear path to self-management. It is not only a health concern, it is the way to self-management if practiced properly, but it is also understanding the world, it is also understanding oneself. So, philosophy is, I will quote from a recent book in this area, that is Invitation to Philosophy. The authors say that philosophy is more than a purely technical subject, more than a purely technical subject, and it is more than a peculiar game, they say. And I shall and they conclude that philosophy is everybody's business, because everyone has to understand oneself, think of oneself. Then we will come to a 2012 book on philosophy for everyday life. It is a very good book that explains the functions of philosophy in personal and collective life. And the book Philosophy for Everyday Life, a Practical Guide, begins with the question, what does philosophy have to do with everyday life? The answer is everything. In fact, everyday life is precisely what philosophy is for. And I will conclude with a contemporary Indian thinker who always insisted on the principle that truth is a pathless land. It is none other than J. Krishnamurti, fondly called J.K. by his disciples and followers.
The truth is a pathless land and cannot be approached by any path whatsoever, by any religion, by any sect. Truth being limitless, unconditioned, unapproachable by any path whatsoever, cannot be organized, nor should any organization be formed to lead or coerce people along any particular path.
He repeatedly reminded, truth is a pathless land. And have it from the French existentialist thinker Jean-Paul Sartre, who said that I am thus responsible for myself and all for all men. I am responsible for myself and for all men. I am creating an image of man as I would have him to be. In fashioning myself, I fashion man. And you can very well see in the contemporary language philosophy, Wittgenstein, who asks a pertinent question, which we shall all share when we consider the value of philosophy. What is the use of studying philosophy if it does not improve your thinking about the important questions of everyday life? What is the use of studying philosophy if it does not improve your thinking about the important questions of everyday life? So, our point is that philosophy is of course a technical discipline, but at the same time it is more important for every human being to understand and practice philosophy in everyday life is the position.
Sir, can you please suggest a few questions that are relevant to further studies in this field?
Yes, you can first of all try to make a comparative study between religion, philosophy and science as the disciplines of human knowledge. You can show how they are related to one another and how they are different from each other. And then you can try an account of the different branches of philosophy like metaphysics, epistemology and axiology, with focus on their concerns, the subject matter of these areas, and also the different schools of philosophy like materialism, idealism, rationalism, empiricism, and how they view these questions of reality, knowledge and value. And then you can finally go to the question on, is philosophy a specialist's discipline, or how philosophy becomes every man's or everybody's business. That is a question you have to work out with your own ideas, how it becomes a concern for every human being. So, these are the main areas you can try to develop.
Sir, can you suggest a few books we can refer to while learning more about introduction to philosophy?
There are two categories of books. One is the traditional histories of philosophy, Indian and Western. One classic example I can tell you, Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. It was published by Allen and Unwin. That will give you a picture. Then on Indian philosophy, there are very good books on the history of Indian philosophy by Hiriyanna, then Dr. Radhakrishnan. If you want to start, you can start with Hiriyanna's book, Essentials of Indian Philosophy, Outlines of Indian Philosophy. Then from the Western side, very good books are coming. Recently you can find books like, which we have referred to in the lecture, that is Philosophy for Everyday Life, a Practical Guide. It is authored by Trevor Kernow, published in 2012 by, it was published by Penguin India Limited, and a very helpful book is Invitation to Philosophy, Issues and Options, authored by three, that is Honor, Hunt and Occom, published by Wordsworth in 2001. The title is Philosophy, Invitation to Philosophy, Issues and Options. Many such books are coming, and you can refer to websites introducing philosophy. There are very good websites that give introduction to philosophical studies. You can search on website and you will get plenty of materials introducing two things mainly. One is the conventional classical position of philosophy as a discipline. Second is how philosophy becomes useful in your everyday life.
Thank you, sir. Hope this session has been helpful to you in understanding the introduction to philosophical studies. We will meet in another session with another topic. Thank you.